When the Allied forces entered the camps at Auschwitz on January the 27th, 1945, what they found was a tragic scene of mass extermination, the likes of which our world had never witnessed before. After Germany sparked World War II and invaded Poland, the Schutzstaffel, more commonly known as the SS, would convert Auschwitz I into a prisoner of war camp. Later on, construction of Auschwitz II, Birkenau, started, which would become the site of countless atrocities. Of the 1.3 million people sent to Auschwitz, 1.1 million people were killed, and their remains desecrated. That, in itself, is a shocking figure. But the world would soon be shocked even more as survivors reported the ghastly truth of what had actually happened. When Hitler assumed control of Germany as the Chancellor from 1933 to 1945, he would implement a policy of mass extermination that had been cited by multiple right-wing extremists before him. And this policy of the Nazi ideology came to be known as the final solution to the Jewish problem. Before the start of World War II, Germany already had multiple concentration camps which acted as detention centers for Jews, political prisoners, and other enemies of the Nazi state. But these were just the foreshadowing of what was to come, and not the full picture. As the Nazis invaded Poland, they set up concentration camps in Polish army barracks. The famous Rudolf Hess oversaw the development of this initial camp and was the camp's first commandant. The reason Auschwitz was chosen was probably because it was located at the junction point of 44 parallel tracks or railway lines that could easily be used to transport prisoners of war. Rudolf Hess would also order the construction of a crematorium, initially intended to be used as a way to burn bodies of executed prisoners or who had otherwise died. But by May 1942, 3 ovens had been installed which could burn 340 bodies in 24 hours, and these began to be used to kill even those prisoners who were alive. In this way, the crematoriums would become a symbol of the ruthlessness of the Nazi regime and their disregard for human life. The Nazis would continue building chambers like these and would construct a total of 5. When Himmler visited the camp in March of 1941, he ordered that the camp be expanded to ensure that even more victims could be sent to Auschwitz. This resulted in the construction of a second camp in close proximity to the original camp called Auschwitz II Birkenau, and it was completed in October 1941. The original camp could hold about 15,000 prisoners of war, while Birkenau could hold more than 90,000. An astounding number, which showed how the Nazi regime was just getting started, and which made sure that Birkenau would become the site of countless atrocities against the human race itself. The prisoners of war included a majority of Jews, which composed nearly 1.1 million of the 1.3 million total prisoners. The other prisoners, about 200,000, were predominantly made up of non-Jewish Poles, Roma people, Gypsies, homosexuals, Soviet prisoners of war, and those who were mentally unfit to be used in Hitler's grand plan for Europe. As one of the greatest tragedies of world history, the scale of horror, death, and torture inflicted on the prisoners of war is hard to grasp, and even harder to comprehend. When the Soviet Red Army finally reached Auschwitz, they found a giant pile of shoes, which had been left behind by the victims of this inhumane tragedy, and photographed it. The picture is powerful yet haunting, and exemplifies the brutality of the Nazi regime, for which human life meant nothing. At Auschwitz, prisoners would arrive crammed into cattle wagons in the worst conditions imaginable. But what waited for them was even worse. On their arrival, they would be given triangular pieces of clothes which were sewn into their jackets above their prisoner number. By July 1942, a large portion of those that were sent to the camps at Auschwitz were of Jewish descent. These victims would be examined by Nazi doctors, and those that they considered unfit for work or duty were immediately sent to take a shower in bathrooms. But these showers would be of a lethal kind, and these bathrooms were actually disguised gas chambers, as this was just a method to whittle down the number of unfit prisoners. These would include young children, elderly couples, pregnant women, and the mentally or physically infirm. Once the unfit prisoners would be inside the gas chambers, they would be exposed to a lethal poison gas called Zyklon B. The biggest tragedy surrounding this entire episode was that these prisoners were never registered in the Nazi database, and therefore it is impossible to find out the true extent of horrible atrocities committed against the weak and the old. Political prisoners would wear a red triangle sewn into their shirts, while German criminals would have a green piece. Prostitutes, gypsies, and the Roma would wear black, and homosexual would wear pink. Jews would be forced to wear a yellow badge in the design of the Star of David, and in this way prisoners would be differentiated into various factions. Furthermore, the nationality of a particular inmate was indicated by a letter stitched into their clothing. Because of this differentiation, a racial hierarchy began to be formed, with German prisoners at the top, followed by non-Jewish prisoners from various countries, while the Jewish prisoners would be at the bottom. Those that did survive the initial gas chambers would be forced into a life of slavery, where many would die from overexhaustion, diseases, a lack of nutrition, and many more would succumb to the daily struggle that was life in Auschwitz. For the men, the day would begin at 4:30 a.m., with the women rising up even earlier when the block supervisor would ring a gong signaling the start of daily labor and slavery. The block supervisor would go around beating the inmates with a stick in order to make them use the latrine quickly. The sanitary arrangements were, of course, absolutely horrible and led to many infections and diseases. For their breakfast, prisoners would only receive 500 milligrams of coffee substitute in order to keep them working. After this, a second gong would be rung in order to call all of the inmates outside and make them stand in neat rows of tens so they could be counted. These inmates would be forced to stand outside for hours on end until the SS officers came for the count. After recounting and making sure every prisoner was present, work would commence. No rest periods were allowed, and even the latrine breaks would be recorded so that the officers could completely control every free second of the inmates' lives. Lunch would be served at midday and consisted of a watery soup that was reported to be disgusting and unhygienic. The evening meal would be a measly 300 grams of bread, which was mostly moldy and unfit for eating. After the day's work would end, a second roll call would take place where floggings and hangings were common. Many would be punished for any infractions that they might have caused. If any prisoner was missing, the rest would be forced to stand in roll call until and unless the missing prisoner in question was found. At night time, the prisoners, exhausted from the hellish labor and the ruthlessness of their Nazi officers, would go to rest and receive their mail. Jewish prisoners would not be allowed any mail, and thus were even kept deprived of any family news on the outside. For sleep, thousands of prisoners would be forced into a single wooden or brick barrack, and as soon as the nighttime curfew gong was sounded, Auschwitz would go completely silent. In the darkness of night, only one madman would continue his experiments. That madman would be Josef Mengele, who had come to be known as the Angel of Death for his crude and inhumane experiments on Jewish prisoners. He would experiment on babies no older than a few months old, and it was his genocidal nature that prolonged the suffering of hundreds of thousands of victims. The night of terror is long and frightening, but it too must come to a close and give way to the light of the morning sun. In 1945, the Soviet army entered Auschwitz, finding approximately 7,800 sick detainees, while an estimated 60,000 had been sent on a grueling death march where many more would lose their lives. More than 1 million would lose their lives in this horrific tragedy. But the pain and sacrifices of those people should never be forgotten, lest we face another tragedy like this.